I have spent the better part of 50 years standing in gravel lots on cold Saturday mornings, holding a paper cup of coffee going lukewarm, watching other people decide what things are worth. That's the trade, if you want to call it a trade. I'm not a rich man. I never was. I drive a pickup older than some of the people who will laugh at me in the story I'm about to tell you. And I've made my living, and more than that, I've made my peace by buying the things that everybody else walks right past. I read objects. I don't read crowds. And there's a difference between those two things that most folks never bother to learn. Because reading a crowd is easy, and reading an object takes patience. And patience is the one thing a Saturday auction crowd never has. So let me take you to a gray, overcast morning in the country, the kind of sky that can't decide whether to rain on you or just sit there gloomy all day out at an old estate sale on a farmstead at the end of a long dirt road. The man who'd owned the place had passed on. A recluse, they said. An old machinist who kept to himself, didn't trust banks, didn't trust people much either. And now his whole life was laid out on folding tables for strangers to pick over. And somewhere in the middle of that gray morning, a whole crowd of grown men and women were going to stand in a circle and laugh at me, out loud, over $90 and a box that nobody on God's earth could open. I'm telling you this right up front so you know where we're headed. They laughed. They really did. But I want you to remember one thing as we go, because it's the whole reason I'm sitting here telling you this at all. By midnight, that same night, not one of them was laughing anymore. Now, if you've never been to one of these country estate auctions, let me set the table for you, because the place itself is half the story. You pull into a field that somebody's mowed down into a parking lot, and the gravel and the mud chew at your tires, and there's a line of folding chairs set up in front of a flatbed trailer where the auctioneer stands with his microphone. The PA system is always half broken, crackling and popping, so every third word comes out like it's being shouted through a tin can. There's a lady selling coffee and day-old donuts out of the back of a van, styrofoam cups, the coffee scalding hot and tasting like the inside of a thermos. The dealers are there early, the ones with the laminated bidder cards and the practiced board expressions walking the tables with their hands clasped behind their backs, pretending they don't want anything while their eyes catalog every single piece. There were tables of rusted hand tools, coffee cans full of bolts, stoneware crocks with hairline cracks, boxes of chipped dishes, a wall of old license plates, the whole accumulated weight of one quiet man's 80-some years on this earth. And the good buyers, the ones with money, had already been through and cherry-picked the obvious things, the clean cast iron, the oak furniture, the anything with a name on it. By the time a lot like the one I'm going to tell you about comes up for bid, it's already been written off 3 times over by people smarter and richer than me. I've been wrong before. I want to be honest about that. I've hauled home plenty of junk that stayed junk, but I've also been right. More often than a man with my bank account has any business being, and the reason is a single idea I've carried my whole life. It's this: the things a person seals up, hides away, goes to real trouble to protect, are almost always the things that meant the most to them. People don't lock up what they don't care about. That idea is the lens I see these sales through, and that morning that lens snagged on something on a back table, and my whole day changed. It was sitting at the end of a table marked miscellaneous, which is auction language for we have no idea and we don't care. A Strongbox. Cast iron. Heavy. The kind of thing they built 100 years ago to last 200. The black paint had flaked off in patches, showing the dull gray metal underneath, mottled with surface rust like liver spots on an old hand. It was maybe the size of a small toolbox, with a lid and a hasp where a lock should be. But here's what stopped me cold, what made the back of my neck go tight the way it does when I found something. The lid wasn't just locked. It was welded shut. Somebody had run a bead of weld all the way around the seam where the lid met the body, a crude hand-laid bead, lumpy in places, but continuous, deliberate, complete. Somebody had taken a torch or a stick welder and sealed that box closed forever, on purpose, by hand. And on the side, in white grease pencil chalk, in the careless hand of whoever was tagging lots that morning, it said, "Junk, $90. I stood there and I felt my heart start going, that quick light tap behind the ribs, and I kept my face flat as a Sunday pancake, because the first rule of this trade is, you never, ever let them see your face change. But inside, I was lit up like a switchboard, because here is the thing that everybody else had looked at and dismissed, and that I could not stop turning over. Nobody welds a box shut to throw it in the trash. Think about it. If it's junk, you toss it. If it's empty, you leave the lid open. A man does not drag out a welder and lay a careful bead around a box that has nothing in it. That weld was effort. That weld was intention. That weld was a man going to enormous trouble to make sure that whatever was inside that box stayed inside until somebody really, truly wanted it out. And the chalk said $90 and the word junk, and the two things could not both be true. One of them was a lie. I was standing in front of a contradiction in cast iron, and contradictions are where all the money hides. The crowd, of course, read it the opposite way, and watching them was like watching people look at one of those drawings that's either a vase or two faces, depending on how your eye lands. A couple of the dealers picked it up, grunted at the weight, gave it a knock with their knuckles, gave it a shake, and when they shook it, something inside moved. Not a rattle, not the bright jingle of coins or the slide of loose scrap. It was a dull, padded, heavy shift, a thud with no edges to it, the sound of something wrapped and bedded down, something cushioned. To me, that sound was a held breath. To them, it was nothing, because they'd already decided. I heard a fellow in a feed store cap say, "Well, you can't open it and you can't see in it, so what's the point?" Probably full of concrete. Another one laughed and said the old man was crazy as a loon. He probably welded up a box of rocks just to mess with whoever bought the place. A dealer I half knew, a sharp-faced guy who buys for a shop 2 counties over, set it back down on the table with a clang and said to nobody in particular, "That's 100 pounds of nothing right there." And the auctioneer's helper, the kid with the chalk, had already written it off, had already filed it under junk in his head and on the iron itself. Every single one of them looked at that weld and saw a problem. A locked door with no key, a thing you couldn't use and couldn't see into, therefore worthless. And I looked at the exact same weld and saw a message. Not junk. Protected, those two readings could not both win, and the beautiful, terrible thing about an auction is that in about 20 minutes, everyone in that lot was going to find out which of us was the fool. They thought they already knew. They were wrong, and they were about to spend $90 worth of certainty telling me so. It took the better part of the morning for the auctioneer to work his way back to that table, and I'll be honest, every minute of it I half hoped somebody else would bid it up and take the decision out of my hands, and half dreaded that somebody would, because by then it was mine in my mind already. When he finally got to it, he hefted it up onto the flatbed with both hands, made a show of the strain, and grinned out at the crowd. "Folks," he said, the crackle of the PA chewing his words, "here's a real mystery lot for you. A Strongbox, welded shut. We don't know what's in it, the family don't know what's in it, and near as I can tell, there's no getting in it without a cutting torch. So who wants to buy a box you can't even open?" And the crowd chuckled, that low-rolling country auction chuckle, and somebody hollered out, "Give you $1 for the scrap iron," and everybody laughed again. The auctioneer started it low. Do I hear? $10 just for the cast iron. Come on. Crickets. Ace scrap fella raised his card lazy. 10 just for the metal weight. You could see him doing the math on the pound price of iron in his head. And then I raised mine. I lifted my bidder card up nice and easy, like it was nothing, and I said, in a clear, flat voice, 90, right over the top of him. $90, all at once. Well, that did something to the air. There was a little ripple, heads turning, a surprised murmur, because nobody jumps a $10 scrap bid straight to 90 on a sealed mystery box. The scrap fella looked at me like I'd lost my mind, gave a little snort, and waved his card flat out. Done. He wasn't paying 90 for iron he could buy clean. And the auctioneer, bless him, he milked it. He pointed his gavel at me and he grinned the biggest grin of the morning, and he said, "Well, now, sold to the brave man in the back, $90, and good luck to you getting it open. Friend." And then the laugh came. Not a chuckle this time, a real laugh, a wave of it, rolling through the folding chairs and out across the gravel, 50-odd people, all enjoying the same easy joke at the same easy target, and the target was me. The fella next to me, a heavy-set neighbor type with a kind enough face, leaned over and said, not unfriendly, buddy, "You just paid $90 for a doorstop, you know that?" Somebody behind me said, loud enough to carry, $10, I bet that old hermit welded his junk mail up in there, and that got another roar. I felt my face go hot. I want to be honest with you. It stung. I'm an old man, and I've heard it all, and it still stung, that particular sound of a crowd laughing and knowing exactly who they're laughing at. But I kept my chin level, and I kept my mouth shut, and I walked up to the front, and I signed my ticket with a hand that didn't shake. Because the one thing they couldn't see, the one thing not a single one of them in that whole laughing lot could see, was the weld. And the weld was still telling me the truth. At the pay table, the clerk, a nice church lady sort, counted my cash and couldn't quite keep the corner of her mouth from twitching up, and she said, real gentle, like you'd talk to someone who'd had a fall, "You sure about this one, hun?" I said, "Yes, ma'am, I'm sure," and I took my receipt. On the way back, a dealer I knew, the sharp-faced one, called over, "Hey, tell you what, I'll take that anchor off your hands right now for 20. Save you the hernia." And a couple of his buddies grinned. I just shook my head and kept walking, because that offer, that little lowball $20 mercy offer, told me he wasn't sure either. A man who's certain something is junk doesn't offer you $20 for it. Then I went to collect my box, and Lord, it was heavy. I got my arms around it and lifted with my knees the way you learn to after a lifetime, and it came up off that table like it was full of, well, like it was full of something, and I carried it across that gravel lot all by myself, every step watched. The muscles in my forearms burning and my back letting me know it had opinions. It was a long, straining, awkward haul, And I'll tell you, that weight felt like more than iron. It felt like the weight of every smirk in that lot riding on my shoulders, and I carried all of it, slow across the gravel to my truck, as I set it down in the bed and slid it forward. The heavy-set neighbor walked past to his own truck and gave me a little salute and said, "Enjoy your treasure chest, partner," and chuckled to himself. And I'll be straight with you, because I promised you honesty. There was one moment right then, one weak human moment, where I thought, what if they're right? What if it's concrete? What if I'm the old fool who paid $90 for 100 pounds of nothing and a story they'll tell at this sale for 10 years? But then I put my hand flat on that cold iron lid, on that lumpy hand-laid weld, and I felt it again, the wrongness of it, the effort of it, and I studied right back down onto the thing my whole life had taught me. You don't seal up nothing. I shut the tailgate. The drive home was the longest 20 minutes I can remember. I took the back roads, the box riding down in the passenger footwell where I'd wedged it so it wouldn't slide, and I swear I could feel the weight of it pulling the truck just a hair to the right on the curves, this dense, quiet presence beside me. And the whole way, the weld kept working on me. I kept seeing it in my mind, that careful, continuous bead all the way around. You have to understand, a sloppy man doesn't do that. A man in a hurry doesn't do that. Whoever sealed that box was a craftsman, somebody who knew his way around a torch, somebody patient enough to do it right all the way around, no gaps. And then I remembered what they'd said about the old man whose place it was. A machinist, worked metal his whole life, a private man who didn't trust banks, who'd outlived about everyone he knew, who kept to himself out at the end of that dirt road. And it started to fit together in my head like two gears finally meshing. Of course, he welded it shut. A man like that wouldn't put what mattered in a bank where some stranger held the key. He'd put it somewhere only his own two hands could seal, and he'd make it so that the only person who'd ever get it open was somebody willing to fight for it, somebody who looked at a welded box and saw worth instead of junk. By the time I turned up my own gravel drive, the light was going soft and gold-gray at the edge of dusk, and I sat there a second with the engine ticking. That box down in the footwell, heavy and patient and full of whatever it was full of, and my mind was already out in the workshop, already on the hacksaw hanging on its nail and the angle grinder on the bench, already turning over how a careful man cuts open something another careful man sealed forever. I cut the engine. I was about to find out which of us was the fool. I carried it into the workshop with the last of my strength, and I set it down on the bench under the bare bulb that hangs on its cord over my V's, and for a long minute I didn't do anything at all but look at it. The light swung a little, the way it does when you bump the bench, and the shadows on that lumpy weld bead crawled back and forth, and I just stood there breathing and looking. Up close, under good light, that weld was even more eloquent than it had been out in that gray field. It was competent work. It was a craftsman's hand. The bead was even, the spacing of the ripples in the metal almost regular, the way a man lays it down when he's done it 10,000 times and his hands know the rhythm without him thinking about it. He'd gone all the way around, every inch of that seam where the lid met the body. No skips, no gaps, no shortcuts. And I started thinking the practical thoughts, the how do I get in thoughts, and I want you to walk through them with me, because they tell you what kind of thing I was dealing with. The lock was no good to me. You can drill a lock all day, but the lid was welded. So the lock was just a decoration at that point, a door behind a wall. Prying was no good. There was nothing to pry, no gap, no purchase. The whole seam fused into one piece of iron. There was exactly one way into that box, and it was the same way the man had sealed it. I had to cut the weld. I had to take my angle grinder and run a cutting wheel right down that bead and unmake inch by inch. What another careful man had made. And I'll tell you, even then, even before I knew a single thing about what was inside, I felt something like respect come over me, and I made up my mind to do it slow. Whatever was in there had been wrapped and bedded and sealed by a man who cared, and I wasn't going to come at it like a vandal. I was going to come at it like I was opening somebody's letter, because in a way that's exactly what I was doing. I put on my safety glasses, and I plugged in the grinder, and it took a breath, and then I touched that spinning wheel to the iron, and the whole workshop filled up with sound. There's no gentle way to describe it, an angle grinder on cast iron shrieks. It's a high, tearing, metal-on-metal scream that goes right through your back teeth, and the sparks came off in a long, bright orange fan, a fountain of them arcing out and bouncing off the concrete floor and dying in little points of light. The smell came up right away, hot iron and scorched old paint, that sharp burnt mineral smell, and underneath it, something older. Something musty and oiled that was leaking out of the seam as the wheel opened it. I worked maybe an inch and stopped. The metal was already hot enough to spit on, and I didn't want to cook whatever was inside, so I waited, let it cool, laid my hand near it to feel the heat come off. Then another inch. Shriek, sparks, the bead glowing dull red along the cut, and then graying as it cooled. Parting a quarter inch at a time. The way you eat something you don't want to be done with. My glasses kept fogging from my own breath, and I kept having to stop and wipe them on my shirt. The sweat ran down into my eyebrows and stung. And the whole time, in the quiet between the screams of that grinder, with the house dark around me and the night pressed up against the windows, I could still hear that crowd. I could hear the auctioneer say, "Good luck getting it open, friend." I could hear that wave of laughter rolling across the gravel. I could hear the neighbor say you just paid $90 for a doorstop. And I'm not too proud to tell you that laughter was fuel. Every time my arm got tired, I'd hear it again, and I'd lean back into the cut. I went all the way down one long side and around the corner and part way up the next, and then I felt the seam start to give, felt the lid go loose under my left hand where I was steadying it, this little shift, this little freedom that hadn't been there before. I set the grinder down. I got my flat pry bar, and I worked the thin end into the cut. And I leaned on it, and there was a groan, a deep, reluctant, rusted groan of iron that had been shut so long it had half forgotten how to be two pieces, and then a crack as the last of the weld let go. And I stopped. I stood there with the bar in my hand and the lid sitting loose on top of the box, and I did not lift it. Because that's the moment, you understand. That's the point of no return, the held breath. The half second where the box can still be anything, where it's still full of every possibility, the rocks and the concrete and the treasure all at once, and once you lift that lid, it collapses down into being only one thing forever. I stood there, and I let myself have that half second. Then I lifted the lid. And it was not concrete. It was not scrap. It was not rocks, and it was not junk mail, and the old hermit was not crazy as a loon. The first thing I saw, the very first thing, was that the inside of that box was packed. Deliberately, lovingly, expertly packed, the way you'd pack something you were sending across an ocean and never expected to see again. There was a layer of oilcloth across the top, that old waxed canvas they used to use. Gone amber and stiff with age, tucked down neat around the edges. And under the oilcloth, when I peeled it back with 2 fingers, there was newspaper, layers and layers of it, yellowed to the color of weak tea and soft as cloth, and I caught the date on a folded edge, and it was from decades back. From a year when this old man would have been a younger man with steady hands and someone, maybe, still living that he loved. The smell that came up out of it was oil and old paper and time, a cellar smell, a closed-up for years smell, and it was the smell of something that had been protected, not abandoned. And right then, before I had uncovered a single thing of value, before I knew $1 of what was in there, I already knew the answer to the question I'd been carrying since that gray morning. That weld was not madness. That weld was love. Or it was trust, or it was both, and the difference hardly matters. My hands slowed all the way down. I stopped being a man trying to get into a box, and I started being a man being let into a confidence. I reached down through the newspaper, and I felt it, the padded weight, the thing that had shifted and thudded so dull and heavy when the dealers shook it out in that field, and I got my hands under it, and I lifted it out, this wrapped bundle, heavier than it had any right to be for its size. And I set it on the clean part of the bench under that bare swinging bulb. I unwrapped it the way you'd unwrap a sleeping baby. The newspaper came away in soft layers, and then there was more oilcloth, and then a wrapping of flannel, an old soft shirt maybe, that someone had given up to the job, and inside the flannel my fingers found the first hard, cold, round shapes. And I knew that feel. Every old auction man knows that feel. The dense, particular weight of metal that money is made of. Coins. Gold coins. Heavy gold pieces in a long rouleau, a roll of them wrapped tight, and when I tipped them out into my palm, they caught that bare bulb and threw it back warm and yellow, that color that nothing else on this earth is, old gold, real gold, double eagles by the look of them, $20 pieces from before 1933, from back before they called all that gold in. The kind of man who didn't trust banks would have quietly kept and quietly hidden, more than I could count at one glance, a roll of them thick as my wrist. And under the coins, bedded in the flannel, there were small bars, stamped ingots, dark with age but unmistakable in the hand. The dense, honest weight of them. I sat down. I had to. There was a stool by the bench, and I found it without looking, because my knees had quit asking my permission. A man does not see that alone at night in his own workshop after a whole crowd laughed him out to his truck and stay standing. But here is the thing, and I want you to hear me, because the gold was not the part that put me on that stool. Under the gold, in the very bottom of that box wrapped separate in waxed paper, there was a worn photograph of a woman, soft-faced, smiling at a camera in a year long gone. And there was a small bundle of letters tied with string. And there was a single sheet of paper folded once in a careful machinist's block printing. A hand that printed the way a man prints who has spent his life making things to 1,000th of an inch. And it said, near as I can remember it, for I've read it more times than I can count since, to whoever opens this: if you are reading these words, then you did not believe them when they told you it was junk. You looked at my work, and you saw that no man seals up nothing. You were willing to fight for it, That is the only kind of person I wanted to have it. Everything I had that the bank could never hold, I put in here. Spend it well, and think kindly of an old man who trusted a stranger he never met to be smarter than a crowd. And I sat on that stool with the gold warm in one hand and that piece of paper shaking a little in the other, and I'll tell you plainly, an old man in a cold workshop at midnight, I cried. Because it wasn't the money, though Lord knows the money was real, more money than my truck and my house and everything I own put together. It was that across all those years, across the grave even, that careful private man had reached out and shaken my hand. His instinct met my instinct in the dark. He sealed it for somebody exactly like me, and I was the one who came. The crowd was wrong. Every single laughing one of them was wrong, and the proof of it was sitting warm and yellow in my hand. I didn't gloat. I want you to know that, because I think it matters. The next morning the sun came up plain and ordinary like it does, and I made my coffee, and I sat at my own kitchen table with that box on the chair beside me, and I did not call a soul. I didn't drive back to that Sail and Crow. I told one person, I told my wife, and I brought her out to the workshop and I showed her, and I watched her face go from that patient, here we go again, look she gives my Saturday hauls. Watched it go all the way to her hand over her mouth and her eyes filling up, and that one face was worth more to me than telling 100. Word gets around in this business the way it does, and within a couple of weeks the rumor had gotten back out to the people who'd been there, and I heard the sharp-faced dealer was telling folks he'd known all along there was something in that box, which made me smile, because he was the one who offered me $20 for it to my face. And the auctioneer, when I ran into him months later at another sale, he wouldn't quite meet my eye, and he said, real quiet, I hear you did all right on that old box, and I just said, I did all right, and let it lie. There's no satisfaction in rubbing a man's nose in it. The satisfaction was already complete. It had been complete the second that lid came up. But there was one more thing I had to do, and it's the thing I'm proudest of. Those letters and that photograph of the soft-faced woman, they had names in them, and a little patience and a few phone calls led me to a grandniece of the old man's, living 2 states over, who barely remembered him. I kept what he plainly meant for whoever fought for the box, because he said so in his own hand, and I honor a man's wishes. But that photograph and those letters, the part of that box that was his heart and not his wallet, I packed those up careful in oilcloth of my own, and I drove them out to her, and I put them in her hands. You should have seen her face when she read his printing. Some things aren't yours to keep even when you've earned them. So that's the whole of it. The box that a crowd laughed at and a man cut open alone at midnight. And I've had a lot of quiet drives home since to think about what it means, and it comes down to something simple enough that I can say it to you plain. People laugh at what they can't open. They do. Show a crowd a thing they can't see into, a thing they can't use, a thing that doesn't give up its worth at a glance, and they will tell you it's junk, and they will laugh at the fool who paid for it, and they will be so sure. But the things folks seal away, the things they go to real trouble to hide and protect and close up tight, those are almost never the things that didn't matter. They're the things that mattered most. Worth doesn't announce itself. Worth sits there welded shut on a back table marked miscellaneous, waiting, patient as iron, for the one person willing to look past the chalk and the laughter and ask why on earth a man would seal something so completely. The auction laughed at the $90 I paid, and that very night, in a little lit-up workshop at the end of a gravel road, I cut it open, and it laughed right back at every one of them. So I'll leave you with this, friend, the way one ordinary person leaves it with another. Don't ever let a crowd tell you what a thing is worth. Trust your own eyes. Look closer than the people around you are willing to look. And when the whole world is laughing and pointing at the thing in your arms, you just keep walking to your truck, because the worth that nobody else can see is very often the only worth having. Take care of yourselves out there, and I'll see you next time.